Now we'll move to a different part of the section of today's, thank you, Gary, with Dr. Alexis. I wonder, it's going to be a fireside chat with Dr. Alexis. Um, Dr. Alexis is an accomplished equity and inclusion strategist, a keynote speaker, and a leadership development facilitator with over 15 years experience. She's the founder and chief strategist for Stokes Strategy and Consulting, partnering with universities, nonprofits, and corporate organizations to build policies, practices, and a culture where everyone can thrive. She previously served as the Associate Chief of Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Harvard University and Assistant Dean at the Harvard School of Engineering. Today, she's going to guide us in exploring the relationship between belonging and AI and how can technology become more culturally responsible and inclusive. Dr. Stokes, please speak a little bit on you, and then could you please start by sharing what belonging means in the context of AI?
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. And I really am appreciative of being here, a part of such a dynamic event that's bringing together so many voices, cultures, traditions, and disciplines together. And this really is central to the work that I do. It's collaboration. That's what we're doing here. And my work really does leverage the power of collaboration and data and dialogue and equity-centered practices to shift policies and systems, leadership practices in a way that increases belonging, it increases accessibility and inclusion. And as you mentioned, I worked at Harvard Engineering and did quite a bit of work in thinking about what does this concept of belonging and accessibility, inclusion, diversity mean within the context of STEM, but specifically within the context of artificial intelligence. So I appreciate your question around what does belonging mean? Because I think sometimes we often will use terminology and assume that we all mean the same thing. And so to ground us in a definition, I think is really critical here. And so for me personally, belonging really is about being seen and seeing others' humanity. It's about taking up space, whether that be in a conversation, within an institution, within a career field. One point that I like to make in the conversation of belonging is that we need to be intentional that the focus is not just on whether or not a person or a community feels like they belong in a certain context. The important question, the bigger question is, do I want to belong in this career field? Do I want to belong within this institution? Is that organization removing barriers and opening doors to ensure that I and others that look like me or those that have historically been denied access can thrive in that particular space and do honest and just work? And so in the context of AI as a field, as well as thinking about the design process, this question that I think about professionally with regard to belonging is, if environments and cultures and organizations are intentionally establishing structures and practices that foster a sense of belonging, then that means people will experience acceptance and integration, meaning their peers and their colleagues welcome and value them and their contribution to the AI. The competence and knowledge, which means they know what's necessary to thrive in that particular space, which means we're not gatekeeping knowledge, we're not gatekeeping opportunities. And they experience safety, the safety to express themselves, their views, their traditions, their culture in the context of AI and designing technology. And so I think we have to really explore if the current culture of AI sends that message of wanting a diversity of voices, prioritizing accessibility and global perspectives. Is this a career field that's open to cultural approaches? This interdisciplinary collaboration and conversation we're having here today and for the total 24 hours. And those that want to be a part of serving the greater good. Is AI ready for that? Is it sending the message that that is in fact what those in the field would like to do?
So in many indigenous communities, and more so also in Africa, there are communities already practice inclusion through their traditions of, say, Ubuntu in the Southern Africa, I mean, among the Bantu and the Harambe around in East Africa, and etc. in other communities. How might these principles shape a sense of belonging where in AI design? And how do we then, as a follow-up to that, ensure that these principles, these social-cultural practices of belonging is not completely lost, and how do we channel them into AI design?
Yes, this is a great question. And within the context of the conversation of AI and compassion, these are principles that should be grounding us. There is so much for us to learn from the indigenous communities and so many African countries that are guided by these principles. I am because we are speaks to the reimagining of AI design, the process in a way that sees the humanity and interconnectedness of us all. It centers having communal responsibility and collective well-being at the heart of the process. Harambe places the group before the individual. There's so much to learn and could completely reshape how we think about not just the design of technology, not just how we are recruiting individuals into the field and into the design process, but to the implementation and launch of the technology. And that again, we're centering humanity and recognizing that without each other, we're not able to thrive. And centering these types of traditional principles leads to a strong sense of belonging at the research level. It increases trust at the implementation level. You know, there's a great deal of skepticism when it comes to technology, especially AI. And this is just disproportionately present in marginalized communities because history has proven that we become the test subject of technology with no regard to the immediate or long-term harm that it can cause. And so for you to bring up these principles, I think is critical when we talk about how do we infuse AI with compassion and honoring humanity, because these are principles that indigenous communities in African countries have been using for long before any of us were here. And I think that's going to be crucial to really redesigning the AI design and research process and even the implementation process.
So you kind of alluded to something that you mentioned about the design phase and the implementation phase. And this kind of sparked a thought I had I was advising a biometrics company, a health biometrics company in the UK on on scaling out the production and reaching out to communities outside the UK. And one of the things we found out was by the time we went to test our technology on our clients, which were mostly in the global south, we found out it was already too late. We didn't involve them early enough. So we didn't check for colored fingerprints. We didn't check for certain things that we should have checked for. So in AI, if we borrow from that mistake we made as hardcore hardware takers, how do we ensure that we create these ecosystems so that these pockets of social cultural knowledges, Harambe, Ubuntu, is not lost? Because my grandfather in Maasai land will not join the AI race, but how do we build that ecosystem so his knowledge, her knowledge is not lost?
Yes, so I think this goes back to something I alluded to in that first question, which is we don't gatekeep. We don't gatekeep the opportunity to have access to the design table. We don't gatekeep the knowledge of this. You know, those traditional practices that you mentioned and philosophies and frameworks, they give rise to the question for me when it comes to AI is what are we hoping to achieve here? What's the impact that we're hoping to have via AI? And how does that relate to our humanity? How does that relate to our ability to thrive and thinking about it through this global lens, through this communal lens, to say not just one community thrives, but we actually all are able to. And I think some of the strategies we need to think about is, of course, who makes up the design team? How intentionally are we being in having diversity at that design table? But also recognizing that this is not going to be a one-step process. This is not going to be a 1 month, 1 year process. This is long term. So we're thinking about what does K-12 education look like? And how are we incorporating AI knowledge there that is culturally sound and responsible? And infusing ethics and really encouraging students. I think the speaker before me talked about thinking critically, and that being a part of education is to help us think critically. How are we doing that at every stage of education for students so that, one, we are nurturing that interest in entering and that sense of belonging of I do belong within the field of AI. And we are educating individuals to go into this field with ethics, with this communal value at the heart of it. Because right now, we're trying to infuse it in a lot of cases where someone may have been in the field now for years, and this is the first time they're really, being forced to think about the impact that it has on communities and on humans. In addition to, I want to say it's what we're doing today. How are we inviting the philosophers, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the community activists, the faith leaders, et cetera, into the design room and being at the table throughout the entire process? That's the beauty of this particular event, is interdisciplinary. It recognizes that for us to be successful, we need all of our various experiences, expertise, cultures, practices at the table. The fact that we are doing this across the world and bringing in these perspectives and these practices from so many different cultures is how we're able to then build technology that recognizes the humanity of everyone. And I think these African principles that you're referencing are an example of how countries in the global South have been doing this for so long, and we have so much to learn.
Thank you very much. Just another quick one on that. I was just thinking about the risk of not including AI in the risk of not including belonging in the design of AI. And if you have any life examples, probably from your time in Harvard in education or in languages, what do we risk when we don't ensure that belonging is at the core of AI design?
I think one of the things that I've heard quite a bit throughout the talks today is around biased technology. In addition to a lack of accessibility, whether the technology itself is not accessible or the field of AI is not accessible. Again, going back to that concept of gatekeeping. If we're not centering this concept of belonging, do people really see themselves in the design technology? Do they see their culture in the implementation process? Are we going into communities to launch a technology and have never taken into consideration that community, heard their voices, and recognize the value of their contribution? That's what's going to lead to a more inclusive and humane design process and ultimately the technology that we create.
Do I hear you say design with the end user in mind?
Yes, with the end user in mind. And you asked about examples. There are examples in healthcare, there are examples in criminal justice system. We think about facial recognition technology that has resulted in wrongful arrest. Because again, algorithms have to be trained. And if it is underrepresented with it as far as certain cultures, communities being represented in that data, if they are not represented in the data that's training the algorithm, if the data that's training the algorithm is biased, it's going to give you biased results. And these have real world acts that are affecting communities. They're affecting communities on the continent. They're affecting multiple racial and ethnic groups and genders, et cetera. And so we really have to think about the end user when we are designing this technology.
Thank you very much. I just want to pause and say to anyone else listening in, please, if you have a question, just drop a line in the chat and we'll get to you. Doc, now I have two more questions I want you to guide us on as we come towards the end of this session. If you could really briefly advise the next generation of AI leaders and especially young African AI leaders, what one practice would you emphasize to keep belonging at the center of their work?
I think one is going back to those traditions that you mentioned, keeping those as central to the work. When I'm working with clients, one of the things that I always do is I start with grounding in the values and what's the goal here. And putting those up, if we're in person, I'm putting them up on the wall and I'm saying, these are saying because we need to constantly be reminded of the goals we've established, the values that are grounding us. And if those values are about humanity, those values are about diversity and inclusion and accessibility and belonging, that gives us something to continuously reference back to. We've all agreed to these are the grounding values and the principles we're operating on throughout this design process, and incorporating check-ins throughout the way. How have we honored these values and these principles? And if we're not able to identify clear ways that we've honored belonging, we've honored Harambe, we've honored these various principles, then that means we need to take a step back. And I think the same way that we center the value of innovation and we center the value of these various things, we have to do the same when it comes to belonging. I think that would be the first thing that I would say is starting the design process. Ground yourselves in those values. Don't step away from them. They're culturally important and they are irrelevant and important to the field and to the design process. And part of belonging is to send that message to all communities to say these traditions that ground your culture bring value to the design room. And so my hope is that leaders within the continent that are leading the way in this space of AI know that the very practices and traditions that they've grown up honoring deserve to be in the design room.
Thank you very much. Just another thing that I thought as you were talking, it's very, and maybe this would be a nice way to wrap up our session, is I was thinking, while while we can really genuinely focus on the region, but also we live in a global world. And I saw a study a few weeks ago, was it a month ago, that the global trust of AI is only at 50% right now. So how do you see belonging in AI intersecting with that global trust in technology?
Yes, I go back to that definition I was mentioning at the beginning around really belonging is grounded in the acceptance and the integration. So that means my contribution, I I am valued within the space. And so I think part of the reason we're seeing that 50% is that there are so many within the world that don't see themselves reflected. They don't see how their culture, how their experience, how their background was valued or is being valued within AI. They don't see it as being accessible to it as well. I think that, and I think also history plays a role in how have communities been subjected to the harm of technology. I also think there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. And so I think it's not there's not one answer to this. I think it's a very nuanced and complex answer. And again, requires that interdisciplinary approach, I think, for us to think about how do we build that trust. But belonging is going to be key to that. People have to really see themselves within this and know that they are valued for them to really start to have trust. How are we being transparent about who was at the design table? Was there diversity within the design team? In addition to the practices of implementing the technology, are they culturally responsible? And I think that will help to build trust.
Is in your opinion, is trust intertwined with stickiness and continued use of technology as it's in other, let's say, if the cell phone is not, you feel there's something wrong. If you don't trust a vaccine, for example, as you've been told before, then do you feel the same would be with AI? Because if you don't trust it, would that mean you'll be less likely to be a habitual user of that specific technology?
Absolutely, you're less likely to use it. So if you think about if there's technology within healthcare that could be beneficial to someone, but they don't have trust and they're saying no to that, that has long-term effects for not just that person, their whole family. And so I think we are seeing that if people don't trust, I mean, look at education. We're seeing that there's a decrease in trust in education, in science, even people are questioning, right? And so we have to understand, what does this role of trust building and belonging and community building and all of that play into this as well? And it has to be incorporated into the conversation, because to your point, if someone doesn't trust something, they're less likely to use it. In addition to, in some cases, you mentioned the phone, many now are starting to feel like I'm being forced, right? Everything is so connected to this device that now it's being pushed upon me. And I don't necessarily think that's the right approach, to push it upon people. I think it's more we're welcoming people in to the process again, to learn the knowledge and things around it. The more you learn about something, that trust is going to increase. So again, how are we really not gatekeeping the knowledge as well?
You mentioned phones, and something came to mind. I read this somewhere that phones are our new babies. The only difference, we don't leave our phones at home with strangers when we go to work. So, um, just just uh, um, just to kind of wrap up, and I want to just to finish up with something that happened to me about a week ago, and I think I mentioned this to you. I dropped by Kenya, and I was in a very small village out with the Maasai, and I met this old lady, and I gave her a lift. And I was trying to make small talk with her, and it was extremely hot day. And I told her, "Hey, it's really hot. What will the cows eat?" And she just smiled and told me, "Oh, don't worry. We saw the hyenas pass yesterday, so it's going to rain soon." And true to that, well, before I got to the gate, it was raining. And the weather forecast had predicted it was going to rain. It was not going to rain for another 4 days. But she was like, "Yeah, the hyenas passed." And we know when that happens, it rains. So it'll be interesting to dig a bit deeper and see what other hidden gems of I think historical knowledge of the environment and the movement of animals and all that. I know rats have been used to detect earthquakes and such stuff, and in different cultures. So I think this really ties in very well with that. So thank you very much for very nice chat. I
Thank you.
wonder if anyone has a question. No, no question yet. All
So
right. Thank
one
you
question.
very much. One question
Oh, I
there.
think we have
Yes.
one.
Hi, hi, hi. So when you said like belonging is being seen, right? So one bigger problem when we talk about building responsibility by the producers, but the consumer part, there is a lack of accessibility for a huge set of people there, right? And what is in Africa that is right now happening to bring more people, that is AI literacy, or having more into accessing these type of technologies? Is there any initiatives or movements that is happening there?
Yes, and I think I heard you correctly. I was having a little bit of difficulty, but I think you were asking with regard to remote areas and
Yes.
accessible being having access.
Lack of accessibility to the AI tools, and also to the tooling efficiency. Even if you are into the technology, if you do not have the tooling efficiency to use AI better, that is the years of experience and those type of things doesn't matter right now. As of now, that is how the world is evolving. So that difference, is there any activities that you are planning or something actionable that you suggest?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question because I think this is a problem that's present in multiple contexts. And so I think one, this is where partnership comes into play. And I think those that do have access to those resources have a responsibility to partner with those in remote areas that may not have access, to increase their access, right? To bring them in, to meet them where they are. And thinking about the long-term plan that we can of how do we ensure that they have sustainable access to that. But I think thinking about this interconnectedness component and humanity also means that those of us that do have greater resources and have greater power or privilege, we have to recognize that and say, how are we using that for the greater good for us all to be able to move forward and progress? I think is going to be a critical question.
Okay, so that means the collaboration, that is, human infrastructure is to be created across from those who have accessible towards that or the efficiency to pass it on to the next layer people, hand holding, right? Only one.
Absolutely. And even institutions, right? Whether we're talking about educational institutions, we're talking about corporate organizations, we're talking about investors for startups and things like that. How are we ensuring that those that historically have not had access or been denied access, or because they're in remote areas, that we don't automatically exclude them from, whether it's the design process or having access to the technology or the resources, to your point, to fine tune that technology as well.
Okay.
Can I quickly just jump on that? It's very interesting, and I've spent quite a big chunk of my life trying to deploy technology in these really hard to reach areas. And I'm glad you brought that up. And there's denial access, there's denial, of course, of devices and infrastructure, but then also there's know-how. And so and maybe I hope AI and this is what I try to advise is to use frugal innovation. Think about how do you design for a hard to reach area instead of internet, use SMS-based technology or something. How do you? So I've and also because of the lack of infrastructure, I've seen Africa frog leap, African countries, not in all, some of them frog leap traditional curves of development. So I have a few examples that is really interesting. I think maybe if I was trying to look it up, AI-powered climate models to support small farmers with drought predictions in Kenya. And I hope now they use the intelligence of this Maasai lady. There's the smart grid integrating renewable energies. This in South Africa, I was there a few months ago, where really hard to reach areas that did not have cold chains, but now they're using smart grids to be able to integrate renewable energies with sustainable cities. And we've seen what Rwanda is doing with drone technology, Zipline, when it comes to delivering remote supplies in medical supplies in remote areas. And what is happening, I think, also in Ethiopia, where they're trying to, because Ethiopia is a home to some huge diverse fauna and flora, and they're using AI and traditional knowledge to map and name all these different species that are very new to science. So there's quite a few interesting AI technologies that are being used in these really low resource, far to reach areas. And it'd be really interesting, I think, at the end of all this, at one point, to collect all these amazing innovations that are being deployed in low resource areas. Sorry, I get too excited
No,
about that.
absolutely. And I think going back to the responsibility of those that have resources, part of it is also platforming in
Yeah.
these types of innovations and putting a spotlight on what is happening, because sometimes biases lead to people assuming that nothing is happening within these lower resource areas or remote areas. And so how are we doing our due diligence to highlight the amazing work that is happening?
Yeah, because towards end of this, really, what actually we are trying to do is to pick up the best practices among different regions and see that how can we apply in a global scope, because we do not have time, and then whatever best practice happening in different regions, that should be collaboratively transferred to the next region, and that is the only way that we could move faster. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful reflections. Well, thank you, Dr. Stokes, for all for guiding us through this session.